Now, if there's one thing I love about Gintama, apart from the plot, comedy, action, voice acting, animation, art style, character, soundtrack, fights, opening, and character design, it's Gintama's historical context. What I mean by this is how Gintama parodies real-life historical Japan. Whether it be certain characters and organisations, or the setting as a whole, it's kind of interesting for a show so completely unrealistic to somewhat ironically be this deeply rooted in reality. So in this video, I'll be taking you on a bit of a history lesson, comparing the world of Gintama with its counterpart of mid-19th century Japan to see how things line up. It's also worth noting there is a lot to talk about, so in this video I'll focus on the more explicit instances of historical influence, and in future videos I'll work my way down to the most minute details to make sure I can cover all that I can. So with all that out of the way, let's get straight into it, starting with the most obvious aspect of Gintama, its setting. Gintama is set in the Edo period, lasting from the early 1600s until its collapse during the Meiji Restoration of 1868. During this time, Japan was governed by the Tokugawa shogunate, a dictatorship under the control of a single man, of course being the shogun. In Gintama, only the final 4 shoguns are ever mentioned, of the 15 that governed Japan during this time period. Some key elements of the Edo period include the government policy of sakoku, or isolationism. Basically, Japan was a massive introvert and cut itself off from the rest of the world, particularly the empires of Europe and the United States. Almost all trade would be internal, no civilians would leave the country, and no foreigners would enter the country. In Gintama, this social policy was ended by the invasion of the Amantos. In real life, this policy was ended by the United States. Basically, this guy sailed over to Japan in the early 1850s in an attempt to get the Japanese to finally open up trade with the rest of the world, and he was successful. After 250 years of Japan's sakoku isolationist policy, Japan finally opened up its borders. And people were not happy, leading to mass rebellion against the Tokugawa shogunate, and eventually the Ansai Purge, or Kansai Purge in Gintama, where the government called upon the execution of anyone who opposed their decisions. This is all deeply allegorical in Gintama. Instead of Japan opening borders to the west and the subsequent rebellions that would proceed, we have Japan opening up borders to the Amantos, and again the subsequent rebellions that would proceed, such as the Joi War. And the Joi War in Gintama is not based on an actual singular conflict, but instead encapsulates and dramatises the outrage as a whole of the Japanese people towards the Tokugawa shogunate with their decision to open Japan's borders. So according to Gintama, Europeans and Americans are aliens. You heard it here first. But anyway, this period is also notable for its rapid evolution of arts, literature and culture. Much like how Europe entered into its Renaissance period following the medieval period, in Japan the Edo period had its own little renaissance that stands to this day. Whenever you think of historical Japanese culture or media, you're most likely thinking of something during the Edo period, like the Great Wave off Kanagawa being a famous example. But anyway, back on topic, Gintama is set in the Edo period, specifically right at the end. During the time period I'll almost exclusively be talking about from now on, the Bakumatsu period, literally meaning end of the Bakufu. And as its name implies, this period saw the end of the Bakufu government, with its climax being the demise of the Tokugawa shogunate's 250-year reign. The Gintama equivalent of this would be the Shogun assassination, farewell Shinsengumi, and Silver Soul arcs. This is known as the Meiji Restoration, one of the most pivotal points of Japanese history, a complete social and political upheaval of Japan with 2 main factions. Those in favour of a new Imperial Japan, and those in favour of the Shogunate, which would, as mentioned, lose. This would culminate in the bloodiest part of the Meiji Restoration, known as the Boshin War, or Japanese Revolution, a civil war from 1868 to 1869 between the 2 factions, including a certain pro-Shogun organisation you may have heard of, the Shinsengumi. But basically, to recap, you have the Edo period, and at the end of that, you have the Bakumatsu period, and at the end of that came the Meiji Restoration, and during that movement came the Boshin War. That's all you need to know to understand Gintama's time period. There's no definitive year in which Gintama is set, it's anywhere just before or just at the start of the Boshin War, so it's a safe bet to assume Gintama is set sometime in 1868, and by extension, the 2-year time skip is set following the end of the war by 1870. It's also worth mentioning that upon the rise of the Japanese Empire, the imperial capital of Kyoto would relocate east to the city of Edo, subsequently to be renamed Tokyo, literally meaning Eastern Capital. Fun fact. But anyway now, let's move on by going back to the aforementioned Shinsengumi, which for the most part are pretty similar to in Gintama. They were both set up as an elite group of ronin specifically picked by the Bakufu government in order to protect the shogun. They existed for a relatively short time, less than you might think, of just under 6 years between 1863 and 1869, most of the time under the command of a familiar name. Kondo Isami, the inspiration behind Kondo Isao. Kondo, Hijikata, Okita, Yamazaki, and Matsudaira all have historical counterparts who filled the same role as they do in Gintama. However, the Shinsengumi does have one key difference to reality. Unlike in Gintama, where the Shinsengumi rebel against the 15th and final shogun, the actual Shinsengumi remain loyal to the Tokugawa shogunate until the organization began to fall with the execution of Kondo at the hands of the new Imperial Japan. After this, Hijikata went on to become the commander of the Shinsengumi, where he too was killed, this time during the Battle of Hakodate, the final battle of the Boshin War, and ultimately marked the end of the Tokugawa shogunate for good. Hijikata in particular seems to bear the most similarities with his Gintama counterpart, both in terms of appearance and personality. For example, just like in Gintama, he was antagonistic to all but those close to him, and was notoriously strict, earning him a familiar nickname, Demon Vice Commander. Pretty much all Shinsengumi members in Gintama have some amount of historical significance, even the most minor ones. Ito, for example, actually did have a personal conflict with Hijikata, like in the Shinsengumi Crisis arc, and Tetsunosuke really was Hijikata's personal assistant. It's interesting to point out that there was also a member of the Shinsengumi known as Nagakura Shinpachi, as Gintama Shinpachi was originally supposed to be part of the Shinsengumi before the idea was ultimately scrapped. And one final pretty noticeable difference would be their uniforms. Gintama's Shinsengumi in their smart black and yellow attire is vastly different from the blue and white howdies worn atop their black or white kimonos worn in real life. But anyway, so far we've only discussed the shogunate and the Shinsengumi, all of which have historical connections with real people, but what about the other side of the Boshin War? Here we have a man called Kido Takayoshi, or by his more familiar alias, Katsura Kogoro. Obviously he's the basis for Katsura Kotaro, but does share some pretty major differences. First of all, and most significantly, Katsura Kogoro was a statesman and politician, not specifically a samurai like his depiction in Gintama. He didn't fight and instead worked behind the scenes. He was one of the most significant people in Japan during the Meiji Restoration, so much so that he's considered one of the 3 great nobles responsible for founding the modern nation of Japan. The other 2 have no connection to Gintama. Some other key facts include his wife, Kido Matsuko, who went by the alias Ikumatsu, sound familiar? And like in Gintama, Katsura attended the Shoka Sonjuku Academy. And that is what I call a segue. Like in Gintama, the Shoka Sonjuku Academy was a private school, notable for producing a good number of famous and influential students we'll get onto in just a sec. But first, let's talk about its founder, Yoshida Shoin. Now obviously, Shoin and Shoyo are completely different for obvious reasons, but one key similarity would be their deaths, both executed as a suspected Jōai rebel against the Tokugawa shogunate as part of the aforementioned Ansai Purge. It's also interesting to note that instead of being executed by Gintoki in Gintama, in reality he was executed by a person by the name of Yamada Asaemon. Again, sound familiar? But anyway, back to his students. Shoka Sonjuku not only paved the way for Ito Hirobumi and Yamagata Aritomo, both future prime ministers of Japan, but also the aforementioned Katsura Kogoro and a certain man by the name of Takasugi Shinsaku. Much like in Gintama, Takasugi was a radical young samurai deeply opposed with the Tokugawa shogunate, and was one of the biggest and most influential advocates during the Meiji Restoration for Japan to return to its old isolationist self. And not long after his time at Shoka Sonjuku, he became the leader of an anti-Bakufu militia known as none other than Kaiheitai, who were significant fighters during the Boshin War, during which they would have been directly fighting the likes of the Shinsengumi. And just like the Shinsengumi, all of the named members of Gintama's Kaiheitai have real-life equivalents. But with that being said, let's move on. You may have noticed so far that I haven't brought up our main trio of Yorozuya even once. And that's because, unlike virtually every other character in Gintama, none of our main trio are directly based on one single historical figure, unlike say Hijikata Toshiro and Hijikata Toshizo. Just thought I should make that clear straight away. But anyway, Shinpachi is definitely the most simple to talk about, As mentioned before, the Shinpachi in his name comes from Nagakura Shinpachi, a member of the Shinsengumi until that idea was scrapped for him to likewise be a member in Gintama. And his family name, Shimura, is based on the late Shimura Ken, a famous Japanese comedian. And this is most likely because Shinpachi is predominantly a comic relief character, usually acting as the butt of the joke. Up next we have Kagura, who, as you might expect, is a lot less obvious to decipher due to her not having a family name as well as, well, being an alien, but the most commonly believed inspiration would be Princess Kaguya from the Tale of the Bamboo Cutter. The Tale of the Bamboo Cutter is a classical Japanese folk story that can trace its origins back to an unknown time in the 9th or 10th century, notable for being the oldest known monogatari in all of Japanese history. Since then, this story has become a popular folktale in Japan to this day, similar to some of the legends and mythology that get passed down here in the West. Much like Kagura, the protagonist, Princess Kaguya, shares one striking similarity, being that both characters are not from Earth, with Kagura of course being an Amanto in Gintama, and Kaguya being from the moon. And alongside Kagura, Princess Kaguya herself is the basis for quite a few characters you might recognise, most significantly Kaguya from Kaguya-sama. But anyway, with that being said, let's move on to the man himself. Much like Kagura, Gintoki's basis also has its origins in mythology, specifically the legend of Kintaro, another Japanese folk story that dates back to an unknown time in the Heian period, from 794 AD to 1185. This legend follows a young boy with superhuman strength known as Kintaro, who would later adopt the more recognisable name of Sakata no Kintoki, and likewise the mountain in which he allegedly inhabited, Mount Ashigara, is now known also as Mount Kintoki. Much like Gintoki, according to legend, Kintaro was incredibly strong, being able to uproot and snap entire trees with his bare hands, and would later also go on to study martial arts. Their respective power would leave both characters with legendary status, with Gintoki as a legend for his strength in the Joai War under the nickname Shiroyasha, and Sakata no Kintoki likewise a legend for his strength under the nickname Kintaro. Apart from that, there's not too many noticeable similarities between the two, except them both being the heroes and protagonists of their respective stories, and in their names, Kin in Kintoki means gold, and Gin in Gintoki means silver. Kintaro was allegedly based on a real person, however, also known as Sakata Kintoki, but again, as with fairy tales and folk stories here in the West, the legend grows stronger with time, so it's hard to say anything with absolute certainty. But anyway, with that being said, as mentioned at the start, there is a whole lot to talk about, so I'll save the rest for part 2 and beyond to slice it up into some more manageable chunks. I also apologise at how short this video is, given how long it's been since I've last uploaded, but that is because of this video that I've been scripting for the last 4 weeks and is sucking the life out of me. It will probably be over an hour and should be out later this month. So there's my excuse, I mean reason for not uploading, as well as, school and that. But with that being said, I'll be back in the next video. See ya!